What do you think about the Japanese emperor's responsibility for the war? It is said that this is how Makaza changed his opinion to let the Showa emperor live and be useful for the occupation Japan. こんにちは。This is Tak Channel. Today I'm going to react to a video of World War II by OverSimplified Part 2. In the previous Part 1, I finished with the explanation of the Nanking Incident, which is relevant to the international issue between Japan and China today. This time, we are finally going to talk about the war between Japan and the US in the Pacific. As in the Part 1 video, I will be explaining the key points from a Japanese perspective, so I hope you will stay tuned until the end. So let's get started.
So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other Allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became... Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage.
The reason why the world was astonished by the news of attack on Pearl Harbor was not only the result of destroying the main force of the US Pacific Fleet. It was a revolutionary idea that overturned the common sense of surprise by air attack. The commander-in-chief of Japanese Allied Fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto, who carried out his operation, continued to oppose the war against the United States. This was because Yamamoto had been stationed in the US and knew what the US was capable of. In fact, at that time, the US was said to have 8 times the potential of Japan. So why did Yamamoto launch a surprise attack on Americans? It is generally believed that he destroyed the US main fleet immediately after the war started and tried to make peace based on that. However, some Japanese historians believe that Yamamoto planned the attack on Pearl Harbor because he wanted to convince the leaders of the Japanese government that war with the US was absolutely impossible by daring to submit a plan that was considered impossible. I agree with this opinion. It was obvious to everyone that Japan, with its lack of resources, had no chance of winning the war against the US. However, negotiations between Japan and the US had stalled, and the reality of starting the war only increased. Yamamoto, a military man, had to think of a way to win as long as he was fighting. As a result, we can say that he attacked Pearl Harbor. Finally, the US entered the war and Japan was on the road to destruction.
They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, "No, you stay." The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible.
Japan also has invaded the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia. In the background, Japan ignored the advice of the US and proceeded to invade China. So when the US cut off the supply of oil and iron, Japan turned to Southeast Asia to secure the necessary resources. The Japanese military and government thought that if they occupied this area, they could continue the war without having to worry about resources. As a result, Japan dragged innocent Southeast Asian countries into the war.
With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. "Alright," said the Americans, "we'll do it your way." Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. "Alright," said the Americans, "let's do it our way as well." Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive the likes of which the world has never seen before invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result,
I cannot understand this divine war. As the war intensified, there was a movement in Japan to use state Shintoism for political purpose. In other words, Japan used religion as a political tool. Saying such a thing may be hard to believe for those who have the image of the Japanese as being famous for having no religion. But at that time, Japan was using religion to win the war. Religion can easily guide people's minds, as is evident in other countries. In fact, education to foster patriotism was provided from elementary school. In 1945, after the end of World War II, the abolition of state Shintoism was ordered. Article 20 of the current Japanese constitution stipulates the freedom of religion. However, this does not mean that Shinto itself is bad, because the ideas of Shinto are still inherited and integrated into our daily lives. Japanese people still going to shrine to pray. The problem is that religion is used for political purpose.
they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began.
The Battle of Iwo Jima is known as one of the most fierce battles of World War II, with more than 20,000 Japanese and American troops killed in the battle. Initially, the Americans thought that the Battle of Iwo Jima would be over in 5 days. However, Japanese continued to fight fierce for over a month. Because if the US occupied Iwo Jima, it would be used as a base for air strikes on the Japanese mainland. The Japanese soldiers who went into the Battle of Iwo Jima were all determined to fight to the death. They were determined to fight as guerrillas, even if they were the last man standing, without dying unless they hit the tanks with bombs in their arms, cut into enemy lines to defeat the enemy, and defeat 10 men each. It's crazy, right? These endurance battles tormented the US for over a month, but Japan was completely defeated.
The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been knocked out. 1 to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships.
In those days, it was considered praiseworthy to die in war for one's country and the emperor. Therefore, surrendering to the other side was never allowed. This was a result of education and brainwashing of emperor worship from elementary school. Therefore, sacrificing one's own life to wage war, as in the Kamikaze special attack team, was the norm. The Kamikaze special attack team is playing with bomb on board that is rammed into enemy ships. Of course, if this is successful, the crew will surely die. This is unbelievable to the non-religious Japanese of today.
The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured.
The Battle of Okinawa. This was the only war fought on the Japanese mainland. The battle was so fierce that it is said to have claimed the lives of 1 in 4 Okinawa people. Also, all girls and boys in their mid-teens were forced to participate in the war, and about 2,000 people died. This is why many people pray for the dead when they go to Okinawa.
The Allies now had to make a choice: either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim.
It is often said that in the US, atomic bomb was right because it ended the war with Japan. It's true that Japan was clearly defeated by the US, but it did not admit defeat. Therefore, the US wanted Japan to surrender as soon as possible to reduce the number of American casualties. In addition, since the former Soviet Union had already decided to enter the war against Japan, the US wanted to take the lead in the world and drop the atomic bomb on Japan before the Soviet Union entered the war. The atomic bomb was dropped on Japanese prefecture of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I think the use of nuclear weapons such as the atomic bomb is clearly wrong. It killed a lot of people. The fact that some countries are still developing nuclear weapons is in itself a mistake for humanity. Incidentally, Hiroshima was chosen as the first target because it was the only one of the target cities that was not thought to have Allied POW camps. Nagasaki was chosen as the first target because of its shipyard where battleships were built.
In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed.
What do you think about the Japanese Emperor's responsibility for the war? 15 days after Emperor Showa announced Japan's defeat in the war, Douglas MacArthur, an American soldier, landed in Japan and implemented various policies to promote democracy. Some people often ask why the emperor was not executed after the war. It is said that Allied powers other than the US at the time wanted to execute him, and that MacArthur was initially in favor of this choice. However, the Showa emperor said to MacArthur, "I do not want the people to carry out the war. I have come to you as one who bears full responsibility for all decisions and actions taken by the people in the conduct of war, and to submit myself to the judgment of the nations you represent." This preparedness of Showa Emperor greatly influenced MacArthur's decision. It came as a shock to MacArthur, who thought that since many losers usually come begging for their lives when they lost a war, the Japanese emperor must be the same. It is said that this is how Makasa changed his opinion to let the Showa emperor live and be useful for the occupation Japan.
Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one.
Oh, this was very informative video again. These were all my opinions as a Japanese man this time. The last one is about the Cold War. So I wanted to react to this next time. I would be very happy if you could leave a request in the comment at the end. Lastly, please don't forget to subscribe my channel and like me. いつもありがとうございます。バイバイ。